For over 200 years, Japan held its breath. If you were born here, you would live and die here. That wasn't a custom, it was the law. Try to leave the country, and the punishment was death. Get shipwrecked abroad and somehow find your way home again? You might not even be let back in. The men who ruled Japan had sealed the entire country shut. Nobody out, almost nobody in. And they'd made it a crime to build a ship big enough to cross the open ocean. They wanted a country that couldn't sail away and couldn't be sailed into. For over 200 years, it held. Japan sat behind its wall of water, still, quiet, closed, while the rest of the world changed without it. And then, on a summer morning in 1853, the people standing on the shore near Edo look out at the water, and they see something that, by every rule they have ever known, cannot be there. 4 ships, enormous, black-hulled, moving against the wind, with no sails up at all, dragging columns of black smoke into the sky behind them. A country that had outlawed ocean-going ships is watching 4 ocean-going warships steam straight into its bay, machines from a world that had left them behind, and the Japanese give them a name that tells you exactly how it felt. The Black Ships. And that morning changes everything. Because over the next 50 years, a single lifetime, this sealed, still sword-carrying country doesn't just scramble to catch up with the world that humiliated it. It builds an empire, it conquers its neighbors, and it takes a European superpower's navy and sends it to the bottom of the sea. So how? How does 200 years of hiding become an empire almost overnight? But that word, sealed, is doing a lot of lying. The version most people carry around is way too neat. The family in charge was the Tokugawa, warlords who'd fought their way to the top and then pulled off something almost no dynasty manages. They made the fighting stop. From 1603, the Tokugawa ruled Japan, and they ruled it for over 250 years. One family, a quarter of a millennium of peace. The way they kept that peace was control. Total control. They froze society into rigid layers, samurai on top, then farmers, then craftsmen, then merchants at the bottom, and they slammed the doors to the outside world. In the 1630s, they threw out the European missionaries, crushed Christianity, and cut the country off. Because Japan was never fully sealed. That's the part the story usually skips. There was always a crack in the wall. Down in the harbor at Nagasaki, a handful of Dutch traders were allowed to stay, penned onto a tiny, fan-shaped artificial island called Dejima, barely 120 meters long, maybe 20 of them there at a time. And through that one pinhole, a thin trickle of Western science and medicine kept leaking into Japan the entire time. There were other quiet doors too, trade with China, with Korea, with the kingdoms to the south. So Japan wasn't a locked box. It was a country watching the whole world through a keyhole. And it took 2 centuries before anyone even gave the policy a name. The word we use for it, sakoku, the closed country, wasn't invented until 1801, near the very end. For most of those 200 years, the Japanese didn't walk around thinking of themselves as sealed off. It was just the way things were. But quiet as it was behind that wall, something was being built. Something nobody, not even the Tokugawa, realized they were building. 200 years of peace did something strange to Japan. It didn't make the country weak, it made it dangerous, just very, very slowly, in a way nobody could see. Think about what happens to a country with 2 centuries of no war. The samurai, the warrior class, the whole top layer of society, suddenly had nobody left to fight. So, over the generations, they stopped being soldiers and quietly became something else. Administrators, bureaucrats, a whole class of people trained to read and write and run things, with nothing to run but paperwork. And Japan, almost by accident, grew one of the most literate populations on the planet. By the end, the best estimates put maybe 40 to 50% of Japanese men able to read. For a country with no factories and no printing revolution driving it, that number is staggering, higher than a lot of Europe at the time. The long peace grew cities. It grew a real cash economy, with merchant families who had serious commercial muscle and networks of credit. And it built roads, because the Tokugawa forced the regional lords to travel constantly to the capital and back, just to keep an eye on them. And that turned the whole country into a web of well-worn highways and busy post towns. Roads, money, cities, mass literacy, a trained class of administrators. Now, I want to be straight with you, because this is where it's easy to lie a little. None of this made an empire. 200 years of hiding did not, by itself, conquer a single soul. What the isolation actually did was quieter than that. It built an engine, it laid down all the parts of a modern nation, and then left them sitting there, cold, waiting for something to switch them on. The black ships were about to switch them on. Back to that morning in 1853. The man on the deck of those black ships is an American naval commodore named Matthew Perry, and he has not come to ask politely. He's carrying a letter from the President of the United States, and the message underneath it is blunt. Open your country to us, or we'll open it for you. Japan is caught completely flat-footed. Their coastal defenses are a joke against steam-powered warships. Their leaders have no good answer. So Perry hands over his demands, tells them he'll be back for a reply, and sails off. He comes back the next year with even more ships, and Japan folds. In 1854, they sign a treaty cracking open a couple of ports. It doesn't sound like much, but it's the first crack in the dam, because the moment Japan proves it can be pushed, everyone pushes. And within a few years come the deals that really sting. The ones the Japanese would bitterly call the unequal treaties. Foreigners on Japanese soil get to live under their own laws instead of Japan's. A foreigner commits a crime, and a Japanese court can't even touch him. Japan loses the right to set the taxes on its own trade in its own harbors. Sit with that humiliation for a second. A proud country, sovereign and untouched for 200 years, suddenly finds that foreigners can walk its streets immune to its laws, and it can't even control the price of business in its own ports. And everyone in Japan who's paying attention is looking across the sea at China, the ancient giant, the civilization at the center of their entire world. China had also been forced open by British gunboats, and China was being carved up like a carcass, port by port, piece by piece. The lesson lands like a hammer to the skull: modernize, fast, or end up like China. But the government that let the black ships in, it's about to pay for that with its life. The shogun had one job. The whole reason the Tokugawa had sat on top of Japan for 2.5 centuries was to protect it, to be strong enough that nobody could threaten it. And the entire country had just watched him fail. He let the foreigners in. He signed the humiliating treaties. He couldn't do the one thing he existed to do. So the knives come out. A movement catches fire around a slogan: revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. Because there was another figure in Japan almost everyone had half forgotten: the emperor. For centuries, the emperor had been little more than a sacred ornament, tucked away in Kyoto, holy but utterly powerless, while the shogun did the actual ruling. Now the rebels rally around him, restore the emperor, tear down the shogun who failed. In 1868, they win. The last shogun steps down. A teenage emperor, history will remember him by the name of his era, Meiji, enlightened rule, is lifted up as the face of a brand new government. They move the capital to the shogun's old city and rename it. Edo becomes Tokyo. Now, you'll sometimes hear this called a peaceful handover. It wasn't. It took a civil war. The shogun's loyalists didn't just bow and walk away. They fought up and down the country, and the fighting killed something like 8,000 men before the last holdouts were finally crushed in the frozen north. The birth of modern Japan wasn't clean. It came out of a war, but the men left standing at the end of it now held the whole country in their hands, and they were about to attempt something no nation had ever done this fast. The new leaders had a slogan of their own, and it tells you everything about what was in their heads. Fukoku Kyohei. Rich country, strong army. That was the whole plan. Get rich, get strong, and never ever be humiliated by foreign ships again. And the speed they went at it is honestly hard to believe. Watch how fast this goes. 1869, They string up their first telegraph line. 1871, they abolish the old feudal domains overnight, wiping centuries of local warlords off the map and replacing them with a modern, centralized state. 1872, the first railway opens, and the young emperor himself climbs aboard and rides it on tracks laid by British engineers. 1873, they build a modern army by conscription, handing rifles to ordinary commoners. And then they do the most radical thing of all. They dismantle the samurai. Really, think about that. The men now running Japan were mostly samurai themselves, and they look at their own class, the sword-carrying warrior elite that had sat at the top of society for 700 years, and they decide it has to go. In 1876, they ban the samurai from even carrying their swords in public. They cancel the guaranteed payments the samurai had lived on for generations. An entire warrior caste, legislated out of existence by its own members, because they decided a modern country simply couldn't afford it. They send a huge delegation halfway around the world, to America, to Europe, for nearly 2 years, and its only job is to study. How do you build a navy, a school system, a constitution, a factory? They fill notebooks with everything, sail home, and start bolting the modern world onto the engine that 2 centuries of quiet peace had already built. It's one of the fastest, most deliberate transformations any nation has ever attempted. But not everyone was willing to stand and watch their entire world get demolished, and the last stand against it would come from the most unlikely man of all. His name was Saigō Takamori, and he wasn't some outsider. He was one of the heroes of the whole revolution, one of the men who'd helped bring down the shogun and put this new government in power in the first place. But Saigō was a samurai down to the bone. And as he watched the new Japan strip the samurai of everything, their swords, their status, their income, their entire reason to exist, something in him snapped. In 1877, he ended up at the head of an army of samurai in the south, in open rebellion against the very government he had helped build. This is the moment the whole gamble gets put to the test, the old world against the new. Thousands of samurai, the finest warriors Japan had ever produced, men who'd trained with the blade since they could walk, against the government's new army of drafted commoners, farm boys with rifles, and the farm boys win. At the final battle, Saigō's samurai are surrounded and cut down almost to the last man. Saigō himself dies there on the hillside, and with him dies the samurai. 700 years of warrior rule, ended by an army of conscripted peasants. It was brutal, it was genuinely tragic, and it was the final proof that the transformation had worked. The new Japan had just beaten the old Japan, decisively, on the battlefield. The sword was finished, the rifle and the railway had won. Now Japan was going to aim all of it outward. Now the country that got bullied by foreign warships becomes the bully. Remember the plan, rich country, strong army, and remember the fear underneath it. Get carved up like China, because the surest way to make certain you're never the carcass on the table is to be the one holding the knife. In 1894, Japan goes to war with China, the same ancient giant that had been the center of their world for 1,000 years. And Japan wins, fast and total. The student humiliates the master. In the peace treaty, Japan takes the island of Taiwan as its first real colony. In one single generation, Japan has gone from being pried open at gunpoint to seizing land of its own. But the moment that stuns the entire planet is still coming. Because in 1904, Japan does the unthinkable. It picks a fight with Russia. Russia, a European empire, a great power, with an army many times Japan's size. The whole world expects Japan to be crushed. Russia sends its Baltic Fleet, one of the great navies of Europe, on an epic voyage halfway around the world to teach the upstart a lesson. 18,000 miles, 7 months at sea, and the two fleets finally meet in the Strait of Tsushima between Japan and Korea. It is a massacre. In a matter of hours, the Japanese Navy, a navy that had not existed at all 50 years earlier, annihilates the Russian fleet. 21 Russian ships sunk, thousands of Russian sailors dead, and Japan loses 3 torpedo boats. 3. Stop and feel the full weight of that. 50 years earlier, the Japanese stood on a beach and gawked at foreign warships they were legally forbidden to even build. Now their own warships had just sent a European empire's entire fleet to the bottom of the ocean. It is the first time in the modern age that an Asian power has beaten a European great power in an all-out war, and the world genuinely does not know what to do with it. The peace deal is brokered, of all people, by the President of the United States, and a few years later, in 1910, Japan formally swallows Korea whole. The sealed hermit kingdom is an empire now. So, how did 200 years of hiding turn Japan into an empire? It didn't. Not on its own. That's the honest answer, and it's the more interesting one. The hiding built the engine, the peace, the literacy, the roads, the trained hands and minds. But an engine just sits there. What actually started it was a shock. 4 black ships and a humiliation so sharp that Japan chose to tear its entire society down to the studs and rebuild it from scratch in a single generation, rather than end up as somebody's colony. Japan became the one nation outside the West that industrialized fast enough to dodge China's fate, the one country that flatly refused to be conquered. And it pulled that off by making a cold, hard bargain. The only way to be certain you are never the victim is to become strong enough to be the aggressor. But there's a shadow over all of this, because that logic didn't switch off once Japan was safe. The same drive that saved Japan from being colonized turned Japan into a colonizer, Taiwan, then Korea. And the machine didn't stop there. That road, modernize, conquer, expand, never be weak again, kept running for decades. It ran into Manchuria in the 1930s. It ran into a savage war with China. And in the end, it ran all the way to Pearl Harbor and into a catastrophe that would swallow the entire Pacific. The country that once made it a crime to build a single ship big enough to cross the ocean had, within one lifetime, built an empire that stretched across one. They opened the country to survive, and once it was open, it could never stop moving until it moved too far.